in lepo pozdravljeni na današnjem predavanju historičnega seminarja ZRC SAZU. Dovolite mi, da pozdravim v angleščini našega gosta, potem pa ga bo predstavila v slovenskem jeziku. So, good morning and welcome to the historical seminar of the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. We are looking forward to your lecture. And if you would now please allow me just to say a few words in Slovenian to present you and start the lecture. Thank you. Torej, današnji gost je dr. Bernhold Schmidt. Študiral je več, kot ste prebrali na vabilu, seveda, študiral je več smeri, torej je zgodovinar, študiral je tudi nemško književnost, in doktoriral iz muzikologije. Tako kot vse življenje je delal na Bavarski akademiji znanosti in humanistike, malo drugače se imenuje kot naša, znanost in humanistika, je pa predvsem strokovnjak v muzikoloških krogih o Orlando di Lassu, to je eden izmed najpomembnejših renesančnih skladateljev evropskih svetovnih. Na Bavarski akademiji je dolga leta delal v komisiji za zbrana dela tega skladatelja in ta projekt se je pred 2 letoma zaključil z izdajo vseh Lassovih del in dr. Bernhold Schmidt se je takrat tudi upokojil, tako da je sedaj upokojeni sodelavec, še vedno zelo aktiven, kot ste prebrali na vabilu, se ukvarja s srednjeveško renesančno glasbo, pa tudi, bom rekla jaz, ki se ukvarja z balotno sodobnejšo glasbo, ki se ji reče Richard Strauss. Danes nam bo predstavil en glasbeni kodeks, ki je pomemben tako iz glasbenega vidika, kot tudi umetnostno-zgodovinskega, kulturno-zgodovinskega in še kaj. Ta kodeks je nastal okrog leta 1560, torej 1559. Njegova zanimivost pa je to, da je v celoti bogato iluminiran. To je eden izmed najbolj iluminiranih, okrašenih, poslikanih kodeksov na svetu. Odtod tudi naslov našega predavanja, torej Orlando di Lasso, njegov skladatelj in najlepši glasbeni rokopis na svetu. So I just announced your lecture about your composer Orlando di Lasso and the most beautiful music manuscript in the world. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind invitation and the kind introduction, and dobar dan all together. It is a great honor for me, and I'm very glad to be here in this wonderful city, in this wonderful rooms of the Slovenian Academy. Maybe you don't know when I got in contact for the first time with Slovenian Academy. That must have been 2001, 2002 in Vienna during a conference at Viennese Academy, Rudolf Lotzinger organized. So I think we met first. And also Ivan Klemenčić in those times was there long ago, but the contract never was broken. And so I'm here. I attended the conference in 2003 here, and Methoda attended the conference in Munich in 2004 with a wonderful paper on Bishop Wren, which is published now. Yeah, maybe 2 words before my lecture. What I have to tell now is, in a certain way, partially an abstract of this book. This is the conference proceedings of a conference in February 17. Andrea Gotthang, an art historian, and I organized at Bavarian Academy, and there are the papers of this conference and also some other articles concerning our codex. Without the conference and this book, I would not be able to give the lecture today here. Thank you for coming. It was probably in 1559 when the Bavarian Duke Albrecht V commissioned a manuscript that was to combine text, music, and images as a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk. The Walloon, Orlando di Lasso, was commissioned to compose the 7 penitential psalms, a group of texts that had been considered to belong together since ancient times, at the end of which he added a motet on Psalms 148 and 150 as a hymn of praise to God. The Munich painter Hans Mielich, a pupil of Albrecht Altdorfer, illustrated the more than 400 pages of the 2-volume codex, which measured an enormous 64 by 41 centimeters. The musical interpretation of the psalm texts is thus accompanied by images that comment on the psalms by establishing associative references to other biblical texts, but also to historical events, and so on. To this end, the Flemish humanist Samuel Quickelberg, who was working at the Bavarian court, wrote explanations in 2 volumes, a commentary on the work which comprises around 2,500 to 3,500 individual illustrations. The codex, now preserved in the Bavarian State Library under the signature Musica Manuscripta A Dutch-Bavarian co-production, rightly deserves to be called the most beautiful music manuscript in the world, as we shall see. The second page shows the customer Albrecht V. He proudly calls himself Utriusque Bavariae Dux, as he was ruler of Upper and Lower Bavaria after the Munich Wittelsbachs gained the upper hand in the Landshut War of Succession in 1504-1505. Albertus Utriusque Bavariae Dux. Upper and Lower Bavaria had been divided in 2 duchies before. The characteristics of a good ruler frame his portrait. At the bottom of the picture, he shows himself to be generous by distributing gifts, albeit from his high horse, but still. Misericordia is written above his head. I hope you can read all. He cultivates hospitality, as shown in the image of him dining with invited guests. The inscription reveals, however, that moderation, the virtue of modestia, is observed during the meal. He is also devoted to science and the arts. A number of books can be seen, their titles legible on the spine, or legible or I hope you understood, on the spine, yeah. Editions of Eusebius and, of course, the Biblia Sacra are depicted, as well as a volume by Josephus F., presumably Flavius Josephus, and what is likely an edition of Livius. Albrecht founded his library, now the Bavarian State Library, in 1558. This reveals his interest in education, and the Munich Jesuit Gymnasium, which still exists today under state management as the Wilhelmsgymnasium, dates from the following year, 1559, around the time when Albrecht commissioned the penitential psalm work. Finally, Albrecht was a great music lover. Next to the closed books, we see an open music book, clearly labeled Musica. Yeah. He maintained one of the most important court chapels of his time, for which he spent a great deal of money. In 1575, he laconically dismissed his advisor's reproaches in view of the growing mountain of debt with the remark that everyone has a different hobby horse. I quote, "With our father, Wilhelm IV, it was hunting. With us, it is music. With our descendants, it will be something else." Lasso, the Princeps Musicorum, as he was called by his contemporaries, worked in Munich. With him, Munich became a city of music of European standing for the first time. The highlight of his work was certainly the Munich Royal Wedding in 1568, a two-week celebration of grandiose proportions. We can see the Duke wants to represent. Since the unification of the duchies of Upper Bavaria and Lower Bavaria, the Munich Wittelsbachs gained power and influence. With Ludwig IV, better known as Ludwig the Bavarian, they had a king from 1314 to 1347 and an emperor from 1328. It is no coincidence that Albrecht is married to a Habsburg, Anna of Austria, an emperor's daughter. I have not yet mentioned the Kunstkammer, for which the building now known as the Alte Münze in Munich was built, and the Antiquarium, one of the most beautiful Renaissance buildings north of the Alps. These two are part of Albrecht's representation. The Book of Penitential Psalms should certainly be understood in this context. However, it would be wrong to view the codex merely as a representative object. It can also be understood as a huge devotional book, as Mielich's illustrations, Quickelberg's commentaries, and finally the music and curage meditation on the psalm texts. Finally, Quickelberg brings another aspect into play, which musicologist Andreas Wernli pointed out. In the introduction to the Declaratio, Quickelberg describes the Codex with its abundant illustrations as, I quote, theatri sapientiae fundatio, as a theater of knowledge. With his Inscriptiones vel tituli theatri amplissimi, published in Munich in 1565, Quickelberg presented a kind of instructions for designing a museum. And he also designed Albrecht's Kunstkammer. It almost seems as if the Mielich Codex can also be understood as a kind of continuation of the Kunstkammer, since it was possible to depict in it what could not be shown in the Kunstkammer. In the Inscriptiones, Quickelberg refers to the Penitential Psalm Codex and calls it a Promptuarium Imaginum, an image archive. Indeed, the Codex shows animals, objects, buildings, and so on that could not be exhibited. This is how the whale is depicted as it releases Jonah. Apparently, in the 16th century, people did not know exactly what a whale looked like. In a painting from Cranach's workshop, which also depicts Jonah with the whale, it looks like a normal fish. We see Noah's Ark several times in different forms and situations. Here, as the various animals leave the ark, accompanied by the Gloria Patri, Noah and his family offering a sacrifice of thanks, and in the dry branches apparently victims of the flood. Here. And also we see the skeleton of an animal. Finally, the Tower of Babel is cleverly partially concealed by musical staves. Is the tower meant to be depicted as so enormous that an area free of musical notes is simply not sufficient for representing it? Or do the musical notes push themselves into the foreground? The Codex is not only to be understood as a devotional book, a theatrum sapientiae, and a representative object, it is also a musical manuscript from which the chapel may even have sung, although this is rather unlikely given its materiality, size, and especially also its sensitivity. Before we turn to Lasso and his role in the penitential psalm work, let us use one page as a case study to illustrate the interaction between the different media and the problems of understanding that can arise from this. Here are the illustrations at the painting of the 8th section of Psalm 31, the second penitential psalm. Page 66 in volume 1 of the Codex contains the soprano and bass parts with the text Verum tamen in diluvio aquarum multarum ad eum non approximabunt. In English, but great floods of water come, they will not reach him. The words not approximabunt, meaning will not reach him, are written on the following page. The psalm text clearly refers to a flood from which a righteous man escapes. The psalm passage is illustrated directly below on the page by a depiction of the flood as described in Genesis 7:11-12. Humans and animals are fleeing, including an elephant and a unicorn, which brings us back to the encyclopedic side of the Codex. There is the elephant and the unicorn. We see those who can try to save themselves by climbing onto the rocky island or into boats. The rocky island is easy to find. The boats, here. Only the spires of a village are still visible. Despair is written on the faces of some people, especially the man in the foreground. His face really is full of despair. The painter's imagination clearly knows no bounds as he shows people trying to secure a cradle high up in a tree to save the child lying in it on the right side. Only one person escapes the flood as God's punishment. Noah is safe in his ark. The waters will not reach him, as it says in the psalm. The illustration in the middle of the page, the burning Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19, 24-25, is associated with Noah's ark, because here too it is a punishment from God, from which a righteous man, Lot, escapes. Lot and his daughters can be seen in the foreground on the left, just over there. And in the background, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. It is not so easy to see. Here. Incidentally, the text and image are directly linked, as in the V in Verum Tamen, as the V in Verum Tamen is formed by two tree trunks. Erum Tamen, and this is the V. Finally, the cause of the punishments is shown, the sinfulness of mankind in the form of the whore of Babylon. Yeah, it's easy to see. Here, as in the other two miniatures, the painter has indicated the Bible passages, Apocalypse 17, Genesis 19, and Genesis 7. This ultimately establishes the connection to Samuel Quickelberg and his commentaries. First, the psalm text, Verum tamen in diluvio, is entered there. Then, what is depicted is explained. Quickelberg also quotes the aforementioned Bible passages. Regarding the whore of Babylon, we read, Babylonica meretrix incidens ac quasi regnans multis aquis, ut est in Apocalypsi, ostendan tibi damnationem meretricis magne, que sedet super aquas multas, cum qua fornicatis sunt reges terre, Apocalypse 17. In English, the translation follows a working translation by Andreas Wernli and Isabella Wiegand. She is a Latin philologist. The whore Babylon sits, as it were, ruling over many waters, as it is written in the Apocalypse. I will show you the condemnation of the great whore who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. The flood is explained in a similar way with Bible quotations and Sodom and Gomorrah even earlier. Quickelberg again quotes from the Bible, Igitur Dominus pluit super Sodomam et Gomorram sulfur et ignem, etc., et subvertit civitates has, et omnem circa regionem, Genesis 19. Therefore the Lord rained down sulfur and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah, etc., and destroyed these cities and the entire surrounding area. However, Quickelberg's explanation preceding the Bible text is puzzling. He writes, Sodoma et Gomorrha delete ob peccata, que non solum igne celesti consumte, sed itiam aquis et paludibus immerse sempiternis. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed because of their sins. They are not only consumed by heavenly fire, but also sunk into eternal waters and swamps. Question. Why Quickelberg associates Sodom and Gomorrah with water and swamps? It is really unclear. In any case, the biblical narrative says nothing about this. But let's take another look at the illustration. Indeed, the painting on the right depicts water with ships, one of which has clearly gone up in flames. Was Quickelberg inspired by the painting and therefore associated water and swamps with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah? Or vice versa? Did Quickelberg himself inspire the painter? This raises the question, which remains unanswered to this day. Who conceived and planned the penitential psalm work with its illustrations? Was it Quickelberg? As classical philologist Isabella Wiegand and theologian Martin Arnett suspect? If so, we would have the concept before us in his commentaries. Can most of the planning be attributed to the painter, as art historian Ulrich Söding believes? You will find the texts in the conference proceedings. Then the explanatory texts would have been written retrospectively to aid understanding of the work. Or was the concept created jointly by several people? Did the Duke have a say in it? And with regard to our page, where does the idea come from that Sodom and Gomorrah will be sunk in eternal waters and swamps, as Quickelberg says? From him? From one of the other participants? Is the idea taken from contemporary Bible commentaries? Quickelberg might see a connection to the Whore of Babylon, who, according to Apocalypse 17, sits on many waters, but that is speculation. We do not know. So, you see, as magnificent as the Codex is, it raises many questions. Of course, Lasso's music also responds to the psalm text. More on that later. First, let's listen to the section in question. The image shows the famous depiction of the Bavarian Court Chapel at the end of the second volume of the Codex, which is controversial as to whether it is an actual performance situation or a kind of idealized image of the court chapel. The Codex is a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, as I mentioned before, in which the psalm text, its interpretation in images and music, and finally Quickelberg's explanations interact in a multimedia way. This requires planning, and agreements were certainly made. What was Lasso's contribution? Or better asked, what must the composition be like in order to fit into an overall concept such as this? But first, I would like to briefly introduce you to the Munich Court Chapel master and his work. Born probably in 1530 in Mons in Hainaut, he entered the choir school at the age of 7, from which he was kidnapped 3 times because of his beautiful voice, not uncommon at this time. His parents brought him back twice, but the third time, in 1544, when he was maybe 14 years old, he followed his kidnapper, the imperial general and viceroy of Sicily, Ferrante Gonzaga, to Sicily and later went with him to Milano. From 1549 to 1551, he lived in Naples, then in Rome, where he was chapel master at San Giovanni in Laterano until 1554. He was a very young man in this time, in this high position. From there, he set off for his homeland to visit his sick parents, whom he did not find alive. He then traveled to France and probably also to England. After his return, he settled in Antwerp, where he worked as a freelancer, living off patrons, and brought his first publications onto the market. From the fall of 1556, he can be traced to Munich, where he lived until his death on June 14, 1594. He was initially employed as a singer and composer, and in 1562 or 1563 he took over the position of court chapel master. In 1558 he married a maid of Duchess Anna, and in 1567 he purchased a house in Munich, later acquiring considerable real estate holdings. He also traveled extensively during his time in Munich. He accompanied the Duke to imperial diets, visited Charles IX of France, and traveled to the Netherlands and Italy to recruit singers for the Munich court. Finally, in 1585, he took a pilgrimage to Loreto. Lasso was perhaps the most important, maybe not, the most important composer of his time, extremely prolific and successful. He can be credited with around 1,350 compositions covering all contemporary genres. He composed over 500 motets, around 175 madrigals and other compositions with Italian texts, approximately 150 French chansons, almost 100 German songs and psalm settings in German language, cycles such of the Prophetia Sibyllarum, the Lagrime di San Pietro, Lasso's swan song, and of course the penitential psalms. In addition, there are well over 50 masses. The authorship of some others is unclear. 101 Magnificats for Passions, and many smaller compositions for the liturgy. His work has been published in over 480 prints from 1555 to 1687, with quite a few pieces appearing in 20 or more prints. Only about 160 settings were not printed contemporary. The number of manuscripts containing his music is likely to be in the 4 digits. A database of Lasso's music in manuscript sources currently lists over 1,500 manuscripts. A major stylistic feature in Lasso's boundless image is Lasso's boundless imagination, his volatility. Normally, and I emphasize normally, his music is not characterized by, I quote, calm flow, but rather by sudden changes of inspiration, by unpredictability. The Lasso scholar Horst Leuchtmann, whom I have just quoted, attests to his inspired madness. The reason for this lies not least in his extreme interest in the musical interpretation of the texts set to music. Hardly any other composer of his time was able to translate words into sound as illustratively and effectively as he did. Here is an example from his madrigal Vecchio se al vero, published in 1587. Also, I will limit myself to a single passage, even though the piece deserves a more detailed presentation. Gabriel Fiamma's text refers to the vie lunghe e distorte, the long and crooked passes. Expressing long paths musically is easy. Lasso chose long note values. You see it in the green frame. But how does one set crooked paths to music? This is where Lasso's imagination comes into play. He apparently thinks of something like a musically straight path, which he then bends. What could a musically straight path be? Something that the knowledgeable listeners is familiar with. That is a musical process that the listeners can think through to its conclusion in their head precisely because they know it, for example, a closing phrase or a cadential phrase. In the second line from the top, framed in red, the following signs. I'm not a singer, but I will try to show. Da, 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 da. The musically experienced listener immediately recognizes how it must continue. Da, 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 da. But what does Lasso? Instead of bringing about the expected conclusion and setting the B flat, he twists the final turn, moving to a completely unexpected note, C sharp. Da, 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 da. Similarly, in the bass, the expected step from F to B flat is avoided, and the cadence ends in A. F and the A. Let's listen to the piece and I'll point out the passage to you. Now. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Lasso in the flesh. Passages of this and similar kinds are not only found in his madrigals, a genre predestined for exalted textual interpretation. Lasso also illustrates words in such an affected manner in his motets. The motet of the late 16th century usually differs from the madrigal in its somewhat calmer pace. Mannerism is rare, but it is not inferior to the madrigal in terms of compositional complexity. Lasso's motets, on the other hand, are sometimes heavily interspersed with madrigalisms, as he tends to ignore genre boundaries altogether. This is illustrated by a second example, a motet. The beginning of the motet in Hora Ultima is set to music in a way that one might expect. The style of the setting is solemn and very serious, with long note values and a dense contrapuntal texture dominating the composition. Of course, it is about the Hora Ultima, the last hour. What comes as a surprise is the sudden change at per ibunt omnia, which is immediately apparent from the notation. When everything will pass away, one would expect a serious, melancholic melody. Instead, the text is quickly chanted in quarter notes. There is no trace of melancholy, and the composition seems rather cheerful. And in the following, when the text lists some of the things that will pass away, tuba, tibia et cythara, iucus, risus, saltus, cantus et discantus, the trumpet, the flute, and the cythara, jest, laughter, dance, song, and polyphony, Lasso imitates the instruments, the laughter, and the dance in a strikingly cheerful manner. A text cannot be set to music more clearly than this. But how is this to be understood? It is about the Hora Ultima and perish. Is Lasso's setting ironic, perhaps even deliberately and intentionally trivial, as if he wanted to portray everything that will pass away as ridiculous, junk, that are worth nothing more than destruction? Only the Hora Ultima, the last hour, would be to be taken seriously from this point of view. Tuba, tibia, et cythara, and so on, would have nothing to do with joy. These things would be the very opposite of the real, the true joy, the joy that man will feel with God. But considerations of this must remain speculation. What is certain, however, is that abrupt breaks in the compositional structure, as in Per ibunt omnia, are not atypical for Lasso. It is also certain that such an extreme interpretation of text as from tuba onwards is not really to be expected in a motet. With Lasso, however, such eccentricities are to be expected in motet as well as in madrigals. Let's listen to the piece. Where do the penitential psalms stand, which, with their Latin text, can certainly be described as motets? There are definitely a number of passages in which the text is interpreted intensively, but considerably fewer than is usual with Lasso. The penitential psalms are therefore not necessarily typical of his compositional style. How did Lasso set the psalm text to music, and why did he compose them this way and not another? This can be briefly explained using the beginning of the sixth penitential psalm, De Profundis Clamavi. This is not digitized, it is taken from an old film, but it will be digitized within maybe few months. They are working on that in Bavarian State Library. The slide shows the beginning of the psalm in the Codex. The text recited is De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. Domine ex audi vocem meam. In English, from the depths I call to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. This is relatively little text. At the end of the text passage, there is also a musical conclusion, which can be recognized by the long note values and the double bars behind them. Here, here, and so on. Maybe a short word about the source type at hand, the choir book. For those who are not musicologists, everything that sounds simultaneously is notated in individual parts. With the 5 fields for the notes, we therefore have the complete 5-part setting in individual parts before us. The shape of the notes is large enough that a small choir can sing from it. This is one voice, the soprano, this is the bass voice, and so on. Now you can see the second section of the 6th penitential psalm. Here, too, there is little text. Fiant aures tue intendentes in vocem deprecationes mie. In English, turn your ear to me, listen to my loud plea. And again, there is a musical conclusion at the end of the text section. And so on. Short, self-contained passages of the text also form a musical unit. The sections set to music are short enough to fit on 1 or 2 double pages in the codex. This may not always work out so smoothly, but it often does. Lasso thus sets the penitential psalms to music in a way that suits the illustrations, which can be adapted because the painter can illustrate short, self-contained passages of text on 1 or 2 double pages. The interplay of text, illustration, and music thus creates meaningful units. The different media can interlock. Lasso did not invent the way he treats the psalm texts. He draws on a model that occasionally uses when setting entire psalm psalms to music, namely the historical model of monophonic liturgical psalm recitation, in which the individual verses also form a self-contained musical unit. The fact that he draws on the liturgical model is evident not least in the fact that each psalm, as in liturgical recitation, concludes with the short doxology, it is the Gloria Patri and the Sicut erat in principio. And the 6th penitential psalm draws particularly strongly on this model, as Lasso uses the monophonic psalm tone as a cantus firmus. In the middle voice, The tenor, you can see the performance model derived from the monophonic liturgical melody around which Lasso builds his polyphonic setting. The recitation is in notes of equal length with the middle caesura of the text et domine emphasized by different notes. The conclusion is similarly structured in the chant melody. The reference to an old liturgical model shows that, despite all the splendor and representation of the codex, the aspect of devotion is also preserved musically. Let's listen to the beginning of the 6th penitential psalm. I go to next because for time reasons. Yeah, the music radiates meditative calm, which may be one of the reasons why there are fewer examples than usual of Lasso's typically exalted interpretation of the text in his setting of the penitential psalms. Instead, it seems that the style in which the cycle is composed is to be understood as an interpretation of the text, adapted to the contemplative character of the texts. Musicologist Christian Leitmayr has pointed out another characteristic of Lasso's penitential psalm composition. In some places, Lasso draws on psalm settings by older composers such as Szoska or Mouton. Leitmayr sees a parallel here with Milich and Quickelberg, since Duke Albrecht's penitential psalm codex also reflects the old tradition of illuminated psalters and penitential psalm commentaries. Lasso's composition is therefore part of a larger whole. The psalm text, Milich's miniatures, Quickelberg's commentaries, and the music are by no means separate entities, but rather form a unified whole, a complex system of overlapping layers of meaning, to quote art historian Katharina Urch. That's an older article, not in the book. This presupposes teamwork for the creation of the codex. Interdisciplinary collaboration was required, and we do not yet know how this took place. As mentioned, it is still unclear who the conceptual designer was. And generally, we are still in the early stages of researching the penitential psalm codex as a whole. The reason why little work has been done on the codex to date is certainly to be found in its materiality. It is too large, too heavy, and ultimately the miniatures are too delicate to be used constantly. I have seen it once when a scholar was working with the manuscript. I was standing behind him, and I was like this over the earth. It was fantastic. You have to handle it with utmost care. Added to this, it is the sheer immensity of its content. This may change. The codex was restored with the help of the Ernst von Siemens Art Foundation, and the first volume has already been digitized. The image shows the link for the first volume of the codex, which can already be viewed on the internet. There is a giant amount of research to be done, and interdisciplinary collaboration is required, since the object itself, the codex, was created through interdisciplinary cooperation. Art history has a central role to play. For example, it is necessary to identify Milich's models. Art historian Katrin Dybala, also not in this book, was able to prove, for example, that the depictions of the five senses on part 78 of the first volume of the codex are based on models by the Nuremberg artist Georg Penz. In the image, the auditus, the sense of hearing, numerous details make the dependence clear. The arrangement of the entire picture, the instruments depicted are identical in shape. The quiver for wind instruments of various sizes in Milich's work next to the lute on the wall. Penz depicts it leaning at an angle. The books, the pig, which is said to have a keen sense of hearing, and so on. And finally, the reference to hearing, or perhaps also to not hearing, in both figures. In Penz's painting, she covers her ear. In Milich's, a lock hangs in front of her ear. On the other hand, iconographic concepts that were previously undetectable can be found repeatedly in the pictorial program, as was noted on various occasions at the interdisciplinary Munich conference on the penitential psalms codex initiated by Andrea Gotthang and co-organized by me in February 2017. Theology is called upon to clarify the understanding of the Bible and the Psalms among those persons involved in the codex. Latin philology, Quickelberg's commentaries sometimes pose a challenge for translation, especially as his terminology is not always easy to be understood. The history of science is called upon, as the codex must also be seen as a theatrum sapientiae. Historical science is called upon. The codex reveals a great deal about how the Wittelsbachs saw themselves and what claims they made. The historian Reinhard Becker, now in Augsburg, was able to show that Albrecht's state is represented in the arrangement of the coats of arms displayed on several paintings, and that the heraldic representations actually depict a form of constitutionalism captured in painting. In addition, the coats of arms depicted in the codex provide an encyclopedic panorama of contemporary heraldic knowledge. Finally, musicology is called upon. Also, several critical editions of the penitential psalms have long been available. The two sources for Lasse's compositions, the codex itself and the 1584 Munich print, have been compared. Lasse's cycle plays a prominent role in the publishing history of the Munich Court Chapel Master, as it was published as the first significant Lasso edition by Siegfried Wilhelm Dehn in 1838. There are also research approaches to the compositional concept. But what role does the music play within the entire penitential psalm work? I have attempted to demonstrate that it fits in it formally. Likewise, that stylistically it is entirely appropriate to the function of the codex as a book of devotion and meditation. The composition's references to older composers such as Josquin and Mouton also draw a parallel with the tradition of illuminated psalters and penitential psalm commentaries, as I have already indicated. It is therefore very well integrated into the overall work. Nevertheless, it would be entirely conceivable to include only the psalm texts without music in a manuscript with its illustrations. Even then, it would still form a meaningful whole. Conversely, the music can also exist independently of the codex. It took on a life of its own in the print from 1584. We are therefore faced with a situation in which the psalm text is interpreted in two ways, both through the miniature and independently of them through the music. Independently, because there are probably no direct references between the images and the music. Or perhaps there are? I'm afraid I don't know. Let me conclude with the words of art historian Andrea Gotthang. Duke Albrecht's penitential psalm work is, I quote, a document of art and cultural history of the first order, which gives us access to the entire intellectual cosmos of a Catholic ruler of the 16th century. Thank you for your kind attention. And I have to apologize my poor English. It was translated by Professor Dr. Beatty.